What's up, guys? It is a bright and early morning here on the West Coast, the normal and reasonable time on the East Coast to talk about some MLB strategy for the day. And I am Chris Spags, ready to be joined in this 12-game journey with my pal and yours, Greg Ehrenberg. How are you doing, Greg?
Right now the only thing worse than investing in crypto is fading the chalk in MLB DFS, because we've got the chalk offense every day, which I'm very rarely rostering just the stone cold chalk offenses in MLB DFS. And not only are they going off lately, but it's going off to the point where it's like, hey, the White Sox, they score like 18 runs. They were going up again. They got position players coming in like the 7th inning to pitch against them. Then last night, the Rays against Matt Harvey, they like 8 runs in the 2nd inning. So it's like, all right, don't have to pay attention to baseball anymore. So hopefully the chalk could cool a little bit tonight.
Yeah, it has been a good day for you guys out there. If you were just playing blindly with ownership projections and following them, our pal Eric Lindquist must be killing it over the last couple of days in MLB. But it is definitely not the norm here for what to expect. And on a 12-game slate, you're probably going to do a little better than to go with the chalk. But we will talk about that. It is a pretty flat expectation for top stacks today, so you can find with our top stacks tool. But let's get to all the deals that we have going on at Awesemo.com, because this is going to be an important one for you guys. As we're going to talk a lot about the top stacks tool, top pitchers tool, the player projections, and ownership projections today. We have this deal going right now for you guys where, hey, maybe you lost that money in crypto and now you are desperately trying to claw your way back. DFS, what better investment pattern is there? And you get in on the gold rush of all the contests that are going on across the industry right now. The NBA playoffs are in full swing. The MLB is going to be going as well. PGA, MMA, NASCAR, NHL playoffs. This is all going on right now. As a result, we have the promo code Gold Rush going at awesemo.com/join, where you can get all the sports, all the data, all the tools for 25% off your first month. And that is a deal that does not come along often. So take advantage of it now. It expires May 20th. So just a few more days left to get in there. And one other deal for the NBA playoffs. If you're a person that doesn't want to spend quite as much as the full monthly package, we also have our special deal going for NBA Showdown season, where there are so many big Showdown tournaments going on right now for the playoffs, even more in the coming weeks. And just for $4.95, you can get 2 weeks of an NBA play or an NBA Showdown Express package, really just an NBA Express package that includes all the Showdown data, along with some grade forms of the regular projections and all of that. You also get access to the premium Slack, so that is going to be a big asset as well, just talking about your various plays, how you're constructing lineups on a given day. Use the promo code PLAY-IN at awesemo.com/join for that one. Again, $4.95 for 2 weeks. And they really make it hard on us with the whoring. So if you don't pay, if you don't go in there and try this for yourself today, what have I done with myself having to yammer away for 4 minutes straight here to start the show? So please go use the promo code PLAY-IN at awesemo.com/join or Gold Rush to get in there as well. And hit that like button too, guys, because these kind of ads, boy, it really takes everything out of me like it may out of you too. So please hit that like button. Let's get going. Greg, any overarching observations on this slate, I guess? Any chalk teams that you want to be playing heavy today to be with the field in baseball, the best place to be?
Yeah, so what's funny is, as much as I just railed on my me being disappointed the chalk has gone off recently, we don't really have chalk today. I mean, if you look at the offenses, there's only 2 offenses projected for over 10% ownership, and it's barely over 10%. That's Washington and Boston. And then you look at the pitchers, I think there's guys that should be chalk plays. Like I think Corbin Burns should almost always be chalk when he pitches. And to an extent he is, but I mean, 20% owned for a pitcher like Corbin Burns. I mean, we usually see a lot higher number than that when there's a clear ace on the slate. And then Shohei Ohtani, who is all the hype in the world right now, you figure he would be a chalk play, but he's only projected for 11% ownership. So this looks like a slate. Just go out and as of now, just kind of play who you think the best plays are, because there is no stone cold chalk.
Yeah, so there got to be a lot of flat ownership, it looks like, so far, but we will talk about some of the higher owned teams as we go. Let's get into it again. The team that we just talked about up top, Tampa Bay, 3.9 implied runs. Gets a much better pitcher than Matt Harvey. John Means will be facing them down today. Means on the year starting to level out a little bit in terms of not having elite stuff, but still has been really good with a 0.71 whip on the year, just a 28% K rate. So for fantasy, not the biggest upside you'd like to see for a guy at his price tag, but in this spot going against Tampa Bay, does have 7 guys that strike out above league average. I don't think it's a crazy spot to go against Tampa Bay here, especially to them coming off the hot day yesterday. I think it's not an awful one at all. 32% aggregate K rate as well for Tampa Bay against left-hand pitching. So Greg, how are you feeling about John Means? The price tag, not the most appealing, but there is some upside.
Yeah, and I mean, also he has, fairly low ownership. We're projecting him for under 10% ownership on DraftKings right now. And, John Means, do I think he's going to be one of the best starting pitchers in baseball going forward as he's been to this point? No, probably not. But I mean, the underlying numbers still look good for him. The 1.21 ERA isn't quite sustainable, but he's a 2.77 expected ERA. And if you go back to last year where he did have a higher ERA, but he had 3.02 expected ERA. So it's kind of funny that the ERA is so much different this year from last year, because if you look at the underlying numbers, it's kind of the same type of pitcher. He's not a super high strikeout guy, but still he does have a 28% K rate this year. So John Means going forward, I still think that he's probably reliably, a number 2 or so starting pitcher. And just given the low ownership on him, which maybe people are just scared off based on how well the Rays performed last night, I don't mind taking some stabs at John Means. I think definitely for tournaments, I'd be over the 9% projected ownership.
Tampa Bay, low implied total for them. I do think the matchup against Means is not the best, so I'm not terribly interested in Tampa Bay, considering the fact too that I think Awesemo said on yesterday's MLB Deeper Dive that historically he hasn't seen the biggest boost in ownership the next day after a stack goes off. So something to keep in mind there. I think for me, naturally, I do sort of think there's a little more vestigial ownership, especially a little more in the way of casual players coming in with the NBA regular season ending as well as the NHL regular season, just getting more bodies in. So I think the Tampa Bay's ownership, just to me, not one I need to see or see the need to get a lot of, Greg. But how are you feeling about the Tampa Bay hitters?
No, it's not a great spot. I mean, John Means, like I said, even though he's probably not going to be somebody who's going to maintain a 1.21 ERA the rest of the season, that would be ridiculous. Still, he has good underlying numbers, all things considered. This is a fairly tough matchup, and this is somebody who last year really started to make noticeable improvements to his pitching game. And even though he had a 4.53 ERA, he still had a 3.02 expected ERA. And he was just kind of done in a little bit by bad sequencing. And then also he had a really high home run to fly ball rate, which based on some of his batted ball numbers, I probably wouldn't have expected to be the case, that he would have a 21.8% home run to fly ball rate. So going forward, I think that John Means is going to be a solid starting pitcher. And there's still some ownership we're projecting to go to Tampa Bay right now. So I don't really think it's a good team to target.
Tampa Bay going to have Ryan Yarbrough going for them today. He's been pitching about 5 innings per appearance, so getting a little bit more than he has in his previous opener days. But his strikeout rate's been down to 19%. I don't see a lot of love for him or the Baltimore hitters, so I think maybe we could save some time, Greg, unless you feel differently. Any Ryan Yarbrough or Baltimore hitters for you?
No, and the other thing, too, about Ryan Yarbrough is that we never know how deep he's going to go into games. He started... not really started his career, but when he first kind of became prominent for the Tampa Bay Rays is because they were the first team to really utilize the opener strategy. So we saw a lot of Yarbrough in an opener role. He was only throwing 2 or 3 innings, and then they had a time where they would bring a reliever in to face like the first couple hitters of the game. Then Yarbrough would come in. But really the moral of the story here is that he's never been somebody who's consistently worked really deep into games. So that really limits his potential upside for me as a starting pitching option. Maybe if it was a smaller slate, I'd want to get to him, but not for something like today.
Yarbrough also only giving up a 1% home run rate. So even though he's not getting strikeouts, he's not giving up a lot in the way of power. So not much to point to here for the hitters or for Yarbrough himself. Next game up, we got Miami 3.5 implied runs against Zach Eflin. Eflin getting better this year, or at least has looked better so far. 24.5% K rate for himself, a 1.17 whip, down from a 1.3 whip since 2019. But he's really not an overpowering strikeout guy. I think the projection works well enough. I get why the field on DraftKings looks like they'll be on Eflin 15%. Going against Miami lineup that strikes out 26.8% of the time against right-hand pitching. But for the most part, Eflin, Greg, I feel like if I get him in an optimizer, I'm not going to be too mad about it, but not a priority play. He's appropriately owned, it looks like, on the top pitcher stool as well.
Yeah, and the strikeout rate this year, 24.5%. It's down a decent amount last year. 28.6% strikeout rate. But then you look at the innings he pitched, it was 10 starts. He only threw 59 innings. So probably more of an aberration, because if you look at him for his total career, he's somebody with a K rate under 20%. So maybe he's a little bit better of a strikeout pitcher than he's been in the past. But on the whole, this isn't really a guy who's a massive strikeout upside pitcher. And this is a slate where I think we have some guys with a lot of strikeout upside that don't have all that much ownership going to them. So like Corbin Burns at 10,300 on DK, I think that he's a really high priority play. And then certainly on single pitcher sites, Corbin Burns also be the priority play for me. And then we just talked about John Means for a second. He's at 9,400 on DK. I think that he should be a lot more than $1,100 more expensive than Eflin. So to me, Eflin's kind of in this no man's land of pricing where I think for $1,000 more, you can get somebody like John Means, who's more favorable, or you could get to a Shohei Ohtani for $1,000 less, who's also more favorable than him.
We got a super chat from Kevin Hess, who's thrown a lot of different bits at us recently with, I guess, an ironic spin on the prank one. And this one did make me laugh a little bit. Any love from Min Price? Is your refrigerator running? So not the most believable name, but I feel like tying it back to a classic prank, Greg, that just worked for me and my comedic sensibilities.
Yeah, so I mean, as it goes for Mr. Refrigerator running, he was once a top 100 prospect, rated by Fangraphs. He is an 80 future speed tool, but he just never quite panned out for whatever reason. He was never able to really get going, and I mean, he is cheap, so maybe it's a good rebound spot for him, but he's just never really lived up to the hype to this point.
And also, I appreciate your approach of playing that seriously too. I feel like given some of the names we've seen in baseball recently, where was it Joneshi Fargas? I feel like for me was one line where I was like, honestly, names could be anything. So if there were an Is Your Refrigerator running, it would not be the most shocking thing in the world of MLB. Miami hitters, I feel like not much interest for me there. Do you feel similarly?
Yeah, and then one other thing on the name. Were you listening to during the Wizards Celtics game last night? There was a highlight of Ish Smith, and I mean, like Charles Barkley, somewhat entertaining, but I mean, like I'm not believing to think he's actually watching many basketball games at this point in his career. But there's a highlight of Ish Smith, and I don't think he'd ever heard of Ish Smith before. So you could just hear him in the background. He goes, "Who would ever name their kid Ish?" And that was just his commentary on an Ish Smith bucket highlight.
I mean, Ishmael, I think, is a common enough name, a famous literary name, too. I'm sure Charles Barkley known for his literary references, but I would say for the most part, I'm an Ish Smith fan and was happy that he was the chalk value player that went off yesterday. So shame on Charles Barkley. Obviously, Greg and I should be your TNT analysts now because we know Ish Smith and Charles Barkley doesn't. I think that proves it better than anybody. Trevor Rogers as a Miami pitcher, a guy that has been a chalk pitcher on some other slates today will not be. His high price tag looks like going to drive the field to single-digit ownership, though. Just a little bit under 10% projected on DraftKings. And I like the spot for Trevor Rogers going against a Philadelphia team that does strike out 29% of the time, actually almost 29.5% of the time against left-hand pitching. Their league average in terms of WRC plus with that 100 WRC plus. The power gets a little bit lower too, 156 ISO. I think it's a pretty decent spot for Rogers here, Greg, and one that does seem like the top pitcher still backs out pretty well. Twice the probability of being a top pitcher today compared to his 10% ownership.
Yeah, I think Trevor Rogers is very legit. I mean, if you look at his numbers so far this year, they're good, and there's nothing to suggest that he's been lucky. He has a 1.84 ERA, but a 2.73 expected ERA, a 2.43 FIP. Strikeout rate is over 30%. The walks are, pretty in check for him. He's limiting hard contact. I think that he's, a very real top of the rotation starter, and I suspect the ownership's going to come up because we've seen, like you said, we've seen Rogers' ownership get to be fairly high on other slates this year. So I think people are hip to the fact that Rogers is a very good pitcher. So I'm curious to see where that ownership ends up later on in the day. But as of right now, I think he's way, way too low owned.
Yeah, I agree. I'm actually surprised. I thought it was maybe the price tag coming up that's making him look a little bit less appealing, or Philadelphia. I guess it is also an 84-degree day in Philadelphia, so you are getting a decent park downgrade for Rogers. And yeah, I still would want to be above the field on Rogers either way, but I think there may be some other factors that hopefully we could figure out a little bit more in the deeper dive. I'll be on the deeper dive today at 12 p.m. Pacific time, 3 p.m. East Coast time, along with Alex and Max Smotrisky on there. So come join us then, and hopefully we'll have some more insights on Trevor Rogers for you guys later on today. Philly hitters, any interest at all here? I feel like they look appropriately owned in the top stacks tool and not a high probability team to get there either.
No, I mean, if I think that Trevor Rogers is really good and going under owned, then it stands to reason I'm not going to like Philly all that much, which is definitely the case. I mean, Rogers, if you wanted to nitpick at all, you go back to last year and you say, well, he had a 6.11 ERA, but also that was only 28 innings. He was still a well-regarded prospect. His stuff is also ridiculously good, and his velocity's gone up a bunch since last year, but he was also really unlucky last year. A 380 BABIP, and you look at his expected ERA was 3.53 last year. So I think that high ERA last year, more than anything, was just bad luck in a really small sample size where he only pitched 28 innings. So going forward, I think Rogers is going to continue to be really good. So I like him. Don't really like the Phillies offense.
All right, next game up, we got the Mets getting 3.6 implied runs against Charlie Morton. Morton, another pitcher who does seem, actually, is he even on the top pitcher still? I think he might not be. He's the pitcher, right? Or do you have him as the pitcher?
Let me just double check, but I think so. Yeah, Charlie Morton starting.
Okay. So yeah, I don't know. We don't have a projection for him. It looks like on the top pitch. I think this game just might not be in for some reason for the pitching, but Charlie Morton, 25% K rate for himself, has been honestly a worse version of the pitcher he was previously. 28.7% K rate since 2019 has been down to 25.3%. His whip has been up from a 1.18 whip to a 1.44 whip. Max exit velocity is also pretty high here, 115.5 miles per hour. Morton, to me, a pitcher that I think maybe still has some of that name recognition. Maybe he does get going against the Mets team that's going to have some pretty crappy hitters in the projected lineup. Khalil Lee, David Peterson going to be hitting as a pitcher, not very good. Janeshi Fargas, who we talked about earlier, has not been doing much. Jose Peraza actually has a sample size of not being a great hitter. Besides that, though, Greg, I don't know that I want to go to Morton. He's pitching under 5 innings per appearance this year. It just seems like he's just not a dude that you want to get to on a slate this size.
By the way, if you refresh the top pitchers page, he's been added in a bunch of other pitchers where they just weren't showing up before. But anyway, Charlie Morton. So here's what is kind of interesting, though. The Mets are dealing with so many injuries, and a lot of them are to the pitching staff, but then still the offense. I mean, everybody's getting hurt for this team almost every day. It seems like there's some other Mets player who's gotten hurt. Something crazy's happening. We had, Kevin Blar got hit in the face with a fastball the other day, and his nose is just totally fucked. He looks like a cartoon character. I saw him doing a press conference yesterday, and they were asking about the injury. It was like, I just feel bad for the pitcher. I was like, I don't know, dude. Like his entire face is swollen. It looked like he got stung by just a bunch of bees. But the Mets have had such bad luck lately. And I just look at all the injuries they're dealing with, and that compiled also with that Francisco Lindor has been terrible to start his Mets career. And I have some interest in Charlie Morton just because of that reason. I don't know what to make of the current quality of the Mets offense, but once you get past the top of the order, it's so thin at the bottom because of all the guys that are out for them. So Morton, I think, is going about appropriately owned. He's somebody that I have interest in having in my player pool. No interest in the Mets offense. But yeah, like getting to like 15 to 20% of Morton seems appropriate to me.
So we just got a bunch of updates on the data. So for some reason you're playing along at home and trying to so follow the Awesemo data tools while we're talking about them. You can't update that stuff now, as I'm trying to do here to make sure we have the most accurate information possible for you guys. But let's keep going through to the other side where we have any Mets hitters interested at all? Looks like a lot of ownership going to Jonathan VR. That to me just seems like a price tag thing. I don't have a ton of appeal going against Morton, even though I'm not as much of a believer in his talent overall.
No, I don't. And it's also just an issue. Number one, I mean, VR's been chalk a few times recently. He had that one game where he, I think, got a single, like stole a base and then scored. Like if he's somebody who's low owned against a pitcher who's going to walk guys, then yeah, I think he makes sense for a little bit of upside. But rarely am I going to have any interest in somebody like Jonathan VR when they're a somewhat chalky play.
The other side, we have David Peterson, who's getting a pretty good matchup against Atlanta. They're striking out at about a 27.8% clip against left-hand pitching so far this year. The lineup that I have today as well, because of Charlie Morton being the mix, I have striking out at about a 35.7% clip. That's going to be a little bit higher. I think William Contreras, too, driving up the strikeout rate for that. But still on the year, 28% K rate for Peterson. He's pitching about 5 innings per start. You can talk me into a little bit of Peterson just because of the matchup. He's certainly not been a great guy himself, but 29.5% K rate for himself. He's faced 139 batters. That's reasonable enough sample size here where I just think as a guy to get 5% of at pretty cheap price tag, I don't mind getting to Peterson here.
To me, I think there's a lot of good pitching options on the slate in general. I mean, I would just look at the numbers for Peterson. Number one, the Braves offense is struggling a little bit lately. I'm not convinced that Ronald Acuna is totally healthy right now. Acuna, who has dealt with a handful of injuries, hasn't forced him to miss an extended period of time, but he had a scare with an oblique injury that he was able to tough out, and he only had to miss a game. Then he rolled his ankle running to first base. He got hit by a pitch on the hand, and I think all of that compiled together is something that's definitely one of the reasons we've seen Acuna take a little bit of a step back in the last couple of weeks. And then I look at Peterson's numbers, and for sure he's striking out a bunch of guys this year. He's giving up a lot of runs, so there is reason to think there's upside. But there's so many pitchers I like today, and I just have to draw the line somewhere. And I'm going to draw a line, I think, at Peterson, because the strikeout rate this year, it's hard for me to totally buy into, because even though he is striking out over 11 hitters per 9 innings, he's a 29.5% K rate. He only had a 19.5% K rate last year. And then you look at his minor league numbers, he wasn't really a prolific strikeout guy in the minors either. So all that considered, and I think that those strikeouts regress a decent amount. And I'd rather get somebody like Shohei Ohtani is in the same price range, just isn't picking up ownership right now.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable take to have. I see what you're saying here. The swinging strike rate and chase rate for him have actually not taken that big of a jump up over the overall sample size. So it might be a bit of an aberration with the strikeout rate as well as the low XFIP. But I just think this lineup is, for whatever reason, it's so bad against left-hand pitching. I'd be willing to take the stab a little bit more, but I get your points as well. Atlanta hitters, though, any interest for you? It does seem like they have to hit better against left-hand pitching at some point, kind of like we talked about earlier in the week with Detroit and Yusei Kikuchi. They happen to get there. Kikuchi still had a mostly workable day in terms of his strikeout performance and all of that, but Atlanta's just been so bad against lefties in a way that I don't think makes the most sense, that I wouldn't mind taking a few stabs on Atlanta hitters as well, just because they have to be better against left-hand pitching given the talent they have.
Yeah, and they also aren't picking up much ownership today. We only have them projected for 3.5% ownership as a stack. It's a number that I definitely want to get overweight to the field on, especially when I look at some of Peterson's numbers and don't totally buy into them. And so I think if regression is coming there, it makes sense to think Atlanta could have a good day. And then also the field isn't there on Atlanta. And, it's not so much just being, because I know a lot of people look at this be like, oh, Atlanta's due. And that's not really the correct way to think about it, in my opinion, as much as it's just regression coming. It's not because they've been bad, they have to start hitting better. It's they have a bunch of really talented hitters, and there's different reasons to think that they should be better going forward. Like Ronald Acuna has dealt with a handful of injuries, stuff like that. Ozzy Albies has always been a better hitter against left-handed pitching than right-handed pitching. So there is a whole bunch of talent at the top of the order. They're also pretty expensive, but there are cheaper pitchers I like today. So I think Atlanta's a team that I want to get to over the 3.5% the field's at right now.
All right, next game up here. And guys, hit the like button if you can. I mentioned it a lot in these shows, but the MLB shows in particular need that extra love because the NBA is just a more popular sport for DFS right now, even with the playoffs going on. So while that is happening, we need the MLB to be as strong as possible here and fight the algorithm and all that to make sure that we're keeping up with the competitors out there. So hit that like button. It helps us out a bunch, probably more than you guys realize. So please do that if you can. It's not just for our egos. It actually does help out the business as well. Next game up, we got Boston, 4.6 implied runs against Ross Stripling, and Boston will justifiably be one of the top stacks on the slate. In terms of the top stack tool, about a 10% chance of being that top stack today. They also will be a little bit higher owned than that, though. Good amount of that ownership going to Kike Hernandez in the top spot here. He'll expect to be hitting leadoff at 3,300, so you get that. But Greg, this is a park that's played really well for power. We saw it yesterday more for the Toronto side, where they did get decent results, even actually a not great fantasy day, but still put up a bunch of runs in that one. And this spot for Boston going against Ross Stripling, who has gotten some more strikeouts here, a 26% strikeout rate, but going back to 2019, a 23% K rate. He's also given up a really high batting average this year, 308, a 1.7 whip for himself. Like, Boston's going to be very chalky today, but I don't know how you wouldn't be with the field on them, even if you do try to kind of dice up the ownership a little bit more.
Yeah, and the other thing about chalk today is there's no team that's going egregiously over-owned on the high end right now. So, like, obviously this is going to look like a bad example, but yesterday I looked at the Rays and said, all right, the Rays have about a 10% chance of being the top stack on the slate, but we ended up having them projected for something like 18% ownership by the time lock game. And to me, that was a team that, at least on paper, looked egregiously over-owned. Obviously, 2 innings into the game, I felt completely different, but at least before the game started, it looked like a spot I didn't want to be on. Today, the teams that we have projected for a lot of ownership, Boston, we have them with 10.9% projected ownership, a 10% chance to be a top stack. And then the overall most roster team right now is Washington with 12.5% ownership share. So it's not like we have one team picking up nearly 20% ownership. So there's no spot that I'd look at and say like, oh, I can't be on it because of ownership reasons. So with all that in mind, Boston looks about appropriately owned. I'd be somewhat even with the field on them. We talked about Ross Stripling maybe last start or 2 starts ago and just how much he struggled overall ever since taking on a full starter's role. When he was pitching out of the bullpen or with somebody who was only pitching, like 3 or 4 inning starts, he was really successful with the Dodgers. But now he's in the American League facing a DH, and the results really haven't been there. 5.84 ERA last year, a 5.91 ERA this year. And if you look at the underlying numbers, also not great, 6.49 expected ERA last year, 4.72 this year. So to me, Stripling looks like a pitcher to attack.
Yeah, I would agree here. And for anybody who's been following along here, as I mentioned, I'll be doing that deeper dive show with Max Motrisky later on. He's a guy that talks a lot about, or a good amount about, launch angles and exit velocity and all of that. And this is a spot for Stripling where he has been getting hit hard. He's also given up a really good launch angle. Boston generally does hit pretty hard and with good launch angles as well. And this park has played extremely well for power. So to me, this is a spot that, get your lower owned guys, maybe get less Kike Hernandez in the field, but there's still guys under 10% ownership. JD Martinez is going to be 6% owned. Marwin Gonzalez, Hunter Renfroe, Bobby Dalbec, these guys all under 5% owned. Getting exposure to Boston, there are ways to do it and get low ownership today. And I think, as Greg was saying, just going to get Stripling seems like a good move. On the other side, you have Garrett Richards, 21% K rate for himself this year, 1.44 whip. All these numbers pretty much in line with his historical numbers, a little bit low on the K rate, but still, Richards not a good guy. And I was willing to go against Eduardo Rodriguez yesterday with Toronto hitters because of the park. This park really underappreciated for how good it's been for producing runs. Going to Toronto again today, to me, Greg, seems like a much better move than going to Garrett Richards. But do you have any interest in either side?
Yeah, as of right now, Toronto looks like one of the most under-owned offenses on the entire slate. We have them only picking up 4.4% ownership share, but also with the fourth highest odds of being the top stack of the day. And I think that we just want to attack offenses whenever they're playing at this ballpark. It's not a major league ballpark. It's made for minor league games. There's an elementary school in the outfield, and people are launching balls into it all the time. So I think there's going to be a ton of home runs hit in this park. I think realistically, it's probably the second most favorable hitters park in baseball right now. The only one being more favorable is Coors Field. So, like you said, Garrett Richards, he's been okay this year. He hasn't been great. He hasn't been bad, except it doesn't take much for a pitcher to totally get lit up in this park. And then the other thing also to consider is that as hard as Eduardo Rodriguez got hit yesterday, the Red Sox had to go into their bullpen a little bit early yesterday. So I think this is another really good spot to go after the Blue Jays.
All right, we got another top stack coming up in this one. We got Washington getting 5.2 implied runs going against Shake Arrieta. Arrieta, another pitcher who has had not a lot to offer this year, an 18.7% K rate for himself. His batting average also that he's allowed is 234, which seems shockingly low given the fact that he has been really bad with a 5x whip on the year. You got to expect some of these numbers to be regressing negatively, especially as weather does heat up, as we talk about a lot in this show. But 5.2 implied runs for Washington, I do feel like, for me, Greg, I might prefer going to the Boston stack more than a Washington stack. This is a lot of ownership for the top four for Washington, where, as I mentioned with Boston, it's a lot going to Kike Hernandez, but the rest of the guys were mostly flat ownership, or if anything, looked a little under-owned. Here you're going to have Juan Soto, Josh Bell, Kyle Schwarber, all over 20%, Trey Turner just behind that. It's a lot of ownership to these dudes, Greg, and I feel like that's something that I like the matchup, but I think just in terms of pure ownership, I might be inclined to go somewhere else.
Yeah, I'm just going to be paying attention to the wind at Wrigley Field, because right now we do have expected 14-mile-per-hour wind blowing out to left center field. And if we get to a spot where the wind picks up at all at Wrigley, we've seen this before, where wind blowing out of Wrigley, sometimes you get like kind of routine fly balls just end up flying out of the ballpark. So if that wind picks up right now, it might cause me to change my tune a little bit. But as of right now, Washington looks like a team to get to, but not quite as much as the field. Right now we have Washington picking up, as I said before, more ownership than anybody else on the slate. The only team that's really remotely close is the Red Sox. Washington right now picking up 12.5% ownership share as a team. Red Sox 10.9%. And then even that Washington ownership is probably realistically a little bit higher, because the hitters that are actually quality in the lineup, like you said, are all really popular. And the only reason it comes down a little bit is because the guys at the end of the order aren't quite as popular. So this is definitely going to be the most popular stack on the slate. I understand why it's the case. But it's a little bit too rich for me, although it would still be a team to get to, but just probably, like 6 or 7% as opposed to the 12.5% the field's at right now.
Yeah, a lot of ownership going to Washington, and we'll see if that changes here. Again, suited to the deeper dive, because we'll update you guys on all the numbers and all of that as we go there too. We got Max Scherzer on the other side, one of the few stud pitchers on the slate, but one that does seem like he's figured some things out with his strikeout rate, which is back up to 36% so far this year, 34.2% since 2019. Also, the walks and hits have been down, a 0.76 whip for himself. Some concerning things, though, with what Greg mentioned with the wind, 52% fly ball rate for Scherzer so far this year, and he's also given up a really high launch angle, 22.7 launch angle, which means that ball could fly around a little bit more than usual. That's sort of the one caveat I would have here. It's also possible, Greg, that Scherzer just misses a lot of bats here for a Chicago team, striking out at a 26% clip. So I think there's some risk to Scherzer, but 32% ownership on DraftKings feels pretty close to where I think you'd want to be.
Yeah, and I think if we look at some of these numbers here with Scherzer that you pointed out before, the launch angle, the highest of his career, the barrel percentage, 8.9%. That's the most he's ever gotten barreled up over his career. So if he struggles in this spot, we're going to see him give up a few home runs. So if you're building 150 lineups, I have no issue with taking a chance on 2 or 3 Cubs lineups, just based on the conditions that it looks like this game is going to be played at. But that aside, I do think the strikeout upside of Scherzer makes him one of the premier pitching options on the slate. The only thing I will say about him that's not really a negative is just I'd rather roster Corbin Burns on the high end of the pitching options. But Scherzer still overall, to me, the second best pitcher on the slate.
Yeah, I would agree. And I do think the Cubs hitters, because of some of the volatility that Scherzer can bring, I wouldn't mind getting some of these guys in one-offs. I feel like it's hard to justify the full stack, but any Cubs hitters interested at all for you, whether it be as one-offs or as stacks?
I don't think there's any one individual hitter that I'm really looking to target from Chicago. Right now, in the initial build I did, I actually have three Cubs stacks, and I mean, like Jock Peterson, he's relatively cheap. Ian Happ. It would really be also is that historically Scherzer's always struggled a little more against left-handed batters. than right-handed batters. And it is nice that some of the left-handed batters in the Cubs lineup are some of the cheaper ones. Like Chris Bryant's really expensive. Javier Baez is really expensive. So if I was making a Cubs stack, I would say they'd probably focus on some of the cheaper left-handed hitters as opposed to the expensive guys like Baez and Bryant. And Peterson and Happ would be the two priorities.
You're not really getting a discount on guys like Bryant, Baez, Rizzo, Wilson Contreras. Like all these guys are priced like they are pitching a much worse pitcher. So I think the full stack is tough to get to. But yeah, I think what you were saying here, one off Jock Peterson to me looks pretty good. One off Jason Hayward has been hitting the ball pretty well. I think I also don't mind, but I would agree. Lefty bats, the cheap lefty bats, probably the ones to get. Next game up, we got Pittsburgh getting 3 implied runs against Jack Flaherty. Flaherty now looking like one of the chalkier pitchers on the slate. He's bringing a 25.7% K rate for himself. That has been down a little bit, as has a swing strike rate. Going back to 2019, he's had a 29% K rate, 13.5% swing strike rate, along with a 31% chase rate. His numbers are down across the board to a 25.7% K rate, 11.7% swing strike rate, 27% chase rate. And this matchup against Pittsburgh, they're not a good team at all. Only a 114 ISO on the year, 83 WRC plus means, as our pal Terry McBride points out often, 17% worse than league averages away. You could view WRC plus with 100 WRC plus being that average number. But the low K rate, the Flaherty's numbers being down, Greg, I don't love Flaherty as chalk. I think he's a safe play. I think for cash, if you were playing that today, going there makes sense. But in terms of the strikeout stuff, I don't know that Flaherty's going to get the best results today against a Pittsburgh team that's not striking out a lot, and him himself just not getting enough in the way of strikeouts for him.
Yeah, and then especially on FanDuel, he's priced all the way up to 10,800. So compare Flaherty to Corbin Burns. And Corbin Burns, to me, is a better starting pitcher, overall better stuff. I'm also, in general, really bullish on Corbin Burns. But on FanDuel right now, we have Flaherty is 10,800. Corbin Burns is 10,500. And we have Flaherty project for almost twice the ownership that Corbin Burns has. Flaherty's projected to be the chalk pitcher on FanDuel. I get the matchup is really easy. But even so, and then we look at DraftKings, where he's only marginally cheaper than Corbin Burns and Max Scherzer, $300 less expensive than Scherzer, $600 less expensive than Burns. To me, those guys are far superior options, but we have Flaherty picking up more ownership. And even if the ownership was the same for all three of these guys, I would still have Flaherty as my least favorite option amongst those guys. So to me, I think Flaherty isn't an outright fade, but I'm certainly going to have way less ownership than the field has on him.
I would agree. In Pittsburgh, because they're not good hitters, I know Alex mentioned yesterday that they offered a decent value opportunity. I don't see the same opportunity there because of the way that Slate looks for just paying up for pitching and all that, and paying up for the other hitting stack. So I don't want to be on Pittsburgh very much for hitters either. And I think Greg, you're probably on the same page there too.
Yeah, no interest in the Pirates offense. They've been really bad this year. And even if I think Jack Flaherty is going a little bit over-owned, that doesn't really mean that all of a sudden I'm looking at the Pirates as a team like, oh, I want to get to them for leverage, because I think there are a lot of good offenses that are going under-owned, and the Pirates are just a bad offense that aren't picking up ownership for good reason.
Trevor Cahill on the other side, another guy that hasn't offered a lot in the way of strikeouts, though, compared to Jack Flaherty, a guy who you could hopefully, I think, could see him get back to his previous strikeout numbers. Cahill since 2019 is at a 19.5% K rate. This year, that's down to an 18% K rate. His xFIP is weirdly low, a 3.7 xFIP for himself, so doing a good job in terms of run prevention, but not a lot in the way of fantasy upside if you're not going to get strikeouts. And St. Louis's lineup, too, not offering a lot in the way of strikeouts either, 23.6% K rate, barely above league average. So I don't get the ownership going to St. Louis necessarily either. I don't feel the strongest there. It does look like their stack ownership be significantly higher than their chance of being a top stack. But Greg, the spot to me, I don't like Cahill. I don't like the St. Louis hitters either. So I don't see a lot to like in this game really in general, I guess, besides the Flaherty ownership that you can justify.
Yeah, it's not like St. Louis is crazy high ownership. It's just crazy high ownership relative to their odds that we have projected of success for them. So, we have them with about 8% projected ownership and then 3% chance to be a top stack on the slate. So that considered not a team I'd want to get to. And then Trevor Cahill himself, no real upside there. He randomly had a bunch of strikeouts last year, but it was also small sample size. He only pitched 25 innings. Half of them came out of the bullpen. So that 29.2% strikeout rate that he had last year, that is not something I ever expect him to come close to repeating. So I'm on the same page as you. Cahill not going to be in my player pool, and the Cardinals, if I do roster them, it's going to be at a much lower clip than the field is.
All right, next game up, we got the Yankees getting 5.2 implied runs. We got Hyung-Jung Yang on the other side of them, and Yang has been not good. And I guess any of the things that you would look at normally, the whip has been, I guess, decent enough here. He's only faced 66 batters so far this year, but 1.13 whip looks okay. The 4.7 X whip, not so good. 20% K rate means you're probably not going to want to play him as a pitcher, but I think we're talking more about Yang in terms of targeting him with the Yankees, who do have one of the higher probabilities to be a top stack today. And I'll say I won't play Yang, Greg. I don't think that's the move to go to, but the Yankee stack, I think there's some utility here, but I'm not seeing anything jump out with Yang that I think he's necessarily a bad pitcher per se.
Well, his KBO stats were pretty bad, so that's a little. His last
you
year,
have your KBO background that gives you a little bit of an edge.
I'm always kind of confused by this because like we've seen guys come from the major leagues go over to the KBO, and by we've seen it, I mean over the 2 months that I played KBO DFS last year, where we had like Samir Despaigne went out and he was like an ace in the KBO. Dan Straley was an ace in the KBO, so I assume anybody who's anyone of a decent pitcher in the major league is just going to go crush over in the KBO. Yang last year had a 4.7 ERA in the KBO, pitching for Kia. I forget what their mascot's name is, but either way, he doesn't have impressive KBO numbers. He did pitch decently in 2019 in the KBO, but he had an ERA over 4 in 2018 and 2020. So overall, to me, it's just curious that he even got a chance at the major league level. He's been pitching in the KBO for forever, even though he's only 33 years old. He started pitching in the KBO when he was 18 years old in 2007. So, I mean, that's something of note, but it doesn't make him any good. He was never really all that successful there other than 1 year. So, and even his numbers over there, like he wasn't striking guys out. He never struck out. And we don't have like that extensive KBO data, but he never struck out a hitter per inning pitching over in Korea. So, by the way, we got a nice note from producer Tyler. It's the Kia Tigers.
I'm just glad to see they're not manipulating service time and getting them out there at a young age.
No. They just throw guys out there. They've got all kinds of. They got 14-year-olds pitching there. Please, it's just lesser wages. But still, I mean, after seeing how little success he had pitching overseas, and even though his ERA is 3.38 so far this year, it's only in 16 innings. I suspect it's going to come crashing down sooner rather than later. So the Yankees, who are not picking up all that much ownership, curiously, are actually a pretty high priority team for me to stack.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. And I think to me, I'm willing to buy in on Yang, being a little bit worse. I just think he hasn't shown that a high propensity, though he has given up a 17% barrel ball rate, pretty high launch angle too. So I think maybe there are some signs that things could get worse than the numbers he's put up so far. And if there is a team that could take advantage of, the Yankees should theoretically be it, though they haven't had a ton of upside in this Texas series so far. They still do have a team that has on the year, the hitting is so bad, a 150 ISO for them, 24.8% K rate. This projected lineup I have having a 204 ISO and a 22.7% K rate. And at some point, Greg, the Yankees have to turn it around. But is anybody in particular for the hitters you'd prioritize? I do feel like you could pay up for Voit and Judge, but you're taking a pretty decent leap of faith there relative to the price tags.
Yeah, so I mean, keep in mind though, I'm legitimately thinking that Yang is going to be one of the worst starting pitching options in baseball going forward, just based on some of his KBO numbers. So yeah, we are paying a premium for the Yankees, and that is what's limiting the ownership to an extent. But Aaron Judge has still been really good, especially as of late. So I don't mind getting to him. Also, he's only picking up 3% projected ownership right now. So that's a number that I certainly want to be overweight to the field on. You mentioned Luke Voit; he's only picking up 5% ownership. DJ LeMahieu is a little bit more popular, but then if you're going down the line, Clint Frazier picking up less than 1% ownership. Gary Sanchez also only 1%. So I think a lot of these guys relative to the ownerships are really appealing options.
Yeah, no, I get it. I think there's not a lot of ownership really going to anybody here besides Gleyber Torres, I guess, expected to be back today. And LeMahieu too, over 10% ownership. But you can really stack up any Yankees you want. It looks like they won't be the highest owned configuration. Corey Kluber on the other side, not been great this year. League average strikeout rate 23% for him. Overall, it seems like the matchup should be decent, though we have seen Texas give some scares this week, including yesterday. Also beat up Jameson Taillon, which I was kind of happy to see. I feel like Taillon was a bit of a paper dragon so far this year. But Kluber going against a team that's 27% K rate. Any interest in him at all, Greg, here, given the fact that Yankees pitchers have not been doing that well in the series?
No, in Kluber, we've seen a pretty dramatic decrease in overall arm talent over the last couple of years. He did get hit by that line drive. Was that last year, 2 years ago, where he ended up breaking his arm? But either way, I think that just overall the age, the mileage on Kluber's arm, and then also combined with some of those injuries like breaking his arm, And at 35 years old now, we've seen the velocity dip, pretty significantly. This is a guy who was at his peak throwing an average fastball over 94 miles per hour this year, all the way down to 90.4 average fastball velocity, just by far the lowest of his career. And it had already taken a step back last year, down to 91.7 miles per hour, now all the way down to 90.4. And he's thrown 41 innings so far, so it's not the biggest sample size, but the velocity, I think, is pretty reliable. And so there's a lot of signs here that this is a former Cy Young winner who's just on the decline and past his prime. And he's also nibbling a lot. I think that he is aware that his stuff isn't quite what it used to be. So he's walking way more guys than we've ever seen from Kluber in the past. He has a 10.7% walk rate this year. And when he was in his prime, he was a guy who was walking about half that many hitters. So to me, no interest in Kluber, but I'm not really all that keen to get to the Rangers bats either.
Yeah, it looks like they don't have the highest potential to be a top stack today. Appropriate amount of ownership. I wouldn't mind getting a little bit of these guys just because I think they've shown they've been a bit better of a hitter than I think people have realized. But against right-hand pitching in particular, I've been sort of impressed by them with the series so far. But that's besides the point, though. They're just not that highly owned for a reason. So get a little bit if you want. Next game up, we got Cleveland, 3.5 implied runs going against Shohei Ohtani, who Greg mentioned earlier. Cheap price tag on him. He's been pitching about 5 innings per appearance so far this year. He has sort of started to level out with the walks and hits, a 1.2 whip for himself on the year, along with a 36% K rate. And I would agree with what you mentioned earlier. I don't mind taking some flyers on Ohtani here. He's only going to be 10% owned, it looks like. Getting to 20% seems reasonable, though. The top pitchers tool, not a big believer in Ohtani, it looks like, does have him as being over-owned with only a 7% chance of being the top pitcher today. So, Greg, where are you going to fall in the Ohtani battle of the day?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much upside here. Whether he's actually going to go through it, whether he's going to come out and throw strikes or not, that seems like a bit of a crapshoot. But if he is throwing strikes, I mean, he's relatively unhittable, right? Like the only outcomes when he's pitching, he's either striking guys out or walking them. Like there aren't too many other outcomes right now. I mean, he has a 36.4% K rate, and then he's also walking nearly 20% of the hitters he faces. So we're looking at over 50% of the outcomes. The ball isn't getting put in play. So the stuff is really good from the velocity way up from last year. And then, I mean, obviously also he was hurt last year and didn't really throw that many innings, but he only had a 93.9 average fastball velocity. We saw him last year. This year, 96.7 average fastball velocity. So the stuff is intact. It just becomes a case of, is he going to throw strikes or not? And to me, there's almost nothing else that matters with Ohtani. He's so good of a pitcher in terms of just his raw stuff that if the ball is over the plate, people aren't going to hit it. So we've seen a lot of strikeouts from him whenever he's been on the big league mound. So to me, low ownership, I'm willing to take chances on him just because of the upside. I understand there's a lot of risk involved, though.
Yeah, there is some risk, and it is a tough top four for Cleveland, where you have 4 guys who hit under league average by a pretty good rate with Cesar Hernandez, Ahmed Rosario, Jose Ramirez, Eddie Rosario as well. All these guys under league average in terms of strikeouts. And you should get one easier guy with Reyes, but then Naylor also strikes out under league average. So I think there's some risk here, but I would agree. I think it's worth getting some exposure. And I also don't have a ton of faith in Cleveland going against him. I guess Ohtani, you could make the case. Just seems like he's due to get hit a little bit harder at some point, but he's not getting guys to chase very well. It's really the one thing. He's attacking the plate pretty hard, it looks like, but 25% chase rate's pretty low. But I would say for Cleveland hitters, if you got a little bit, I wouldn't be mad at it, but they are going to be 1% owned, a 2.8% chance of being a top stack. It's not a priority by any stretch.
No, not a priority, but really whenever Ohtani's pitched this year, I've made it a point for me to be overweight to Ohtani and then also be overweight to the offense he's going against, just because I think there's so much variance there. Because at any given time, Ohtani might not make it out of the second inning. He might come out and walk 5 guys in the first inning. And we always know that the Angels are going to be really cautious with him. They'll have a quick hook with him if he doesn't have it going. So there's always going to be upside in targeting against him, especially because people just don't like to do it. We have the Indians project for less than 1% ownership right now. So a sensible number to get 2 or 3x the field on. Doesn't take much of an investment to do that either. So I'll be overweight to both sides. Yeah,
and if Ohtani does get hit early, it's a pretty bad bullpen behind him too, giving up almost 260 batting average, a 1.5 whip on the year. So there's a lot of things here that could be positive for Cleveland if they do get to Ohtani. Definitely a good volatility spot to target. Aaron Savale on the other side has been down to a 19% K rate this year since 2019. Is at a 21% K rate, so just an under league average. A strikeout pitcher, but does get decent results. Has been pitching deep enough into games that I think at his price tag, I wouldn't mind him. I think I would prefer Ohtani. I would prefer I forget who we we talked about earlier. There was somebody else in that price range that I think was also pretty passable. I know David Peterson was a guy, but I would say to me, getting a little bit of Savale seems fine, but not a priority by any stretch. He's just sort of a fantasy pitcher. I think a better real life pitcher than he is a fantasy one right now.
And then we have the other issue too, where on the Angels side, there's no Trout. Trout's out for the next 6 to 8 weeks. And then we also have Ohtani because of DFS, I'd still not being able to figure out what to do with him. His points don't count when he's hitting. So to me now, all of a sudden, we've taken the 2 best fantasy producing Angels out of the lineup. We don't have those options for today. And then even if the Angels do have a big game, it's pretty annoying that you can't roster their best hitter. So that's always something that I've been considering whenever Ohtani pitches, is that we can't get hitting points out of him. That makes it really hard for me to get to the Angels as a stack.
Yeah, they are not a high probability stack either. 2.8% chance of being a top stack along with 2% ownership. So if for some reason you do want to go there, you can. But as Greg mentioned, it is sort of tough to get that correlation right. And you are missing some key bats for them as well. We got next game up, Milwaukee, 4.3 implied runs against Brad Keller. Brad Keller has been worse this year than usual. He's normally been a guy that's done pretty well in terms of run prevention. This year, though, he is up to a 1.86 whip, a 320 batting average allowed, only an 18% carry. It's actually an improvement for him, but it's still one of the worst marks on the slate for this year's numbers. And Keller, not somebody I would want to get to very much, but Milwaukee's hitters too look overowned according to the top stacks tool. You are going to expect to have Christian Yelich back in again, barring him, I guess, getting injured once more. But it does seem like it's a Milwaukee team that's getting better, Greg, but I don't really love Milwaukee. And I definitely don't like Brad Keller.
Yeah, I mean, we could safely say we're going to get at least one bat out of Christian Yelich today. I think the last time he started, just off the top of my head, I should have looked this before, but I think we got 2 at-bats out of him, and then he got hurt again. So Christian Yelich has not been in the lineup very often this year, so who knows what he's even going to look like, because I doubt that he's taken all that many practice swings during the time that he was out, given how injured he's been so far this year. But yeah, Keller's numbers have looked awful this year. The strikeout rate, he's never been a high strikeout guy, and that's still the case this year, 17.8% strikeout rate. But the issue here is the 9.8% walk rate, so he's not working deep into games, number one, because his pitch count's getting up because he's walking a lot of guys. But then the Royals don't want to leave him in the game either, because he has 6.75 ERA and a 7.34 expected ERA. So I understand why the field is getting to the Milwaukee Brewers, but I agree with your point. I think that they're going a little bit over-owned. We do them with a decent chance to be the top value stack on the slate. But to me, I don't really think it's too much of a priority today, because it's not like we have any of these starting pitchers are ridiculously expensive. I think Corbin Burns is the best overall option. We're going to talk about him in a second, but it's not like he's 11 or 12,000 or anything like that. And then I think we have a relatively cheap, good SP2 to get to with a lot of upside in Shohei Ohtani. So I don't feel like I need to save all that much money on offense. So I'm fine with being much lighter on the field on the Milwaukee Brewers.
Yeah, and also Keller, the one thing that he does do is keep the ball down, only a 28% fly ball rate, so you're not going to have that power upside either. Brewers to me just look a little bit overowned in a variety of ways. The other side, though, Greg has been teasing this guy all show, so we got to dig deep on him. Corbin Burns, a 45% carried for himself on the year, which is, I think, the best mark besides DeGrom overall in the season. Really been really good in every way. There's really nothing you could point to that I think reflects poorly upon him. Launch angle's been low. The exit velocity has been low for him as well. 0.64 whip, 1.3 xFIP. These are all fantastic numbers. And he's going against a Kansas City team that doesn't strike out a lot. So I guess that's sort of the one thing that you can kind of ding Burns for, but still he gets results over and over again, Greg, that I think he looks under-owned right now at 23% projected ownership on DraftKings.
A 45.3% strikeout rate and a 0.8% walk rate. That is, those are just silly type of numbers. Like that's almost impossible. Like even in a video game, I know Tyler's not doing this with his created character and Road to the Show. Not even close to see able to do stuff like that. So I know if people have been listening to a lot of our shows this year, I'm a bit of a mark for Corbin Burns. I have bets on him to win Cy Young from before the season started. So somebody who I was already really high on, and then he's pitched so well so far this year that I haven't seen any reason to back off the stance I have on him. And I'm frankly confused by his ownership today. Just every time he takes the mound, I expect that he's just going to be stone cold chalk. And we only have him projected for 23% ownership on DraftKings right now on FanDuel. We have Corbin Burns projected for 12% ownership. He's my favorite pitching option on the slate. I'm not afraid of the matchup against the Royals. I don't really understand why he isn't more popular.
I think there are some as Trout was a Trout runner JH just saying there are some other concerns in this game right now. It does look like it's a yellow game, so some degree of risk, and but keep that one close to your pocket though for now, because if assuming this game does play, Burns, I think I would agree, it looks like the best pitcher on the slate, and I don't think the ownership is reflecting the weather concerns right now, so that could easily clear up. We'll talk more about it in the deeper dive coming up in a few hours. I think Royals hitters were in agreement here. Just we don't even need to talk about them, right?
Just fade.
Yeah. Frankie Montas in the next game getting 4.2 implied runs for Houston or against Houston. Houston does not strike out a lot, a 19.2% K rate against right-hand pitching. Montas also has been such a worse strikeout pitcher since his PED suspension, and I think you maybe can connect those dots for yourself if you want out there. But a 21% K rate for Montas here, 4.4 xFIP. He looks bad. The Houston hitters, I think, can get to him, but I don't have a high confidence level here. The park not playing fantastically. I really don't like a whole lot on either side, Greg, but do you like Montas or the Astros?
I don't like Montas. I do have interest in the Astros, though, just because they're picking up so low ownership right now. I think Montas still has a little bit of name value just because he broke into the league with a lot of hype. He was throwing really hard. Even though he had the steroid suspension and his strikeout rate is down, he still throws pretty hard, 96.5 average fastball, 96.5 mile per hour average fastball velocity this year. But I mean, Houston with only a 3.7% ownership share. I think that's a team to get to just based on that, because Montas this year, 4.93 ERA, a 4.56 expected ERA. You go back to his numbers last year, 5.6 ERA, 4.58 expected ERA. He's been a slightly below average starting pitcher, only slightly above replacement level. So with that in mind, I think Houston, who I do expect going forward, is going to have one of the best offenses in baseball. This is a spot I want to target.
We got on the other side, Zach Greinke going against Oakland. Greinke, a pitcher that for the most part, not a guy that I often get to. 18.7% K rate for himself this year. I think that's got to get better compared to the 22.7% K rate since 2019, but that's still an under league average number. So Greinke, just one of those guys better in real life than fantasy. And this year really hasn't been that good at either side. So to me, Greinke a non-factor, but Oakland, too, I don't see them getting to Greinke in a meaningful way. And Houston's bullpen, not great behind him, but still passable enough that I think this is another spot. I guess this whole game for me, not the most interesting.
Yeah, and Oakland is picking up a decent amount of ownership. I think there were spots early in the year where it made sense to target Greinke because there were some signs that he was going to regress this year. But now it kind of looks like the field is hip to that fact. We have Oakland projected for 4% ownership. So if this was a spot where they're projected for less than 1% ownership, I would say go out and target Oakland. But not with the field kind of being there in an appropriate way. So I agree with you. No real interest in Greinke. No real interest in the Oakland offense. I think this should be pretty neutral on both sides with no significant fantasy upside.
We got our last two games here, guys. And this one, I think, unless it's changed throughout the course of the show, we do not have a starting pitcher on one of the sides. So hit that like button because we are making the best we can with the MLB, sometimes being tough to navigate at this point in the morning. We appreciate you guys for being here, and make sure you come back later today. In about 3 hours, we'll have that MLB deeper dive with myself, Alex Awesemo Baker, and Maximo Trisky taking you guys through the slate one more time. You're focusing more on the top pitchers, top sacks, and all of that instead of going game by game. So tune in then and join us. And of course, subscribe to the channel, but really hit that like button now if you can. We got Arizona, and again, no implied runs in this game going against Clayton Kershaw. Clayton Kershaw has a 28% K rate for himself this year, but Arizona doesn't strike out a lot. This is 22.5% K rate for them on the year. They've also had shockingly good power against lefties with the 192 ISO. I really think you could theoretically go to Arizona here, but I don't really love that spot. To me, Kershaw also looks a bit overowned at 18%. I would rather go in a bunch of different directions. We talked about some of the stud pitchers. I'd rather go Corbin Burns' way, assuming that game plays. I'd rather take the shot on Scherzer. There's a lot of ways you can go here, to me, that don't involve Clayton Kershaw.
Yeah, and Kershaw is obviously still a very good starting pitcher, even at this point in his career. It's just that the other options on the slate, to me, are better ones. I'd rather roster Max Scherzer. I'd rather roster Corbin Burns. I'd rather roster Jack Flaherty than Clayton Kershaw. Kershaw this year, it's not that his numbers are bad by any means. They're very solid. The strikeouts are still there. He's a 3.2 ERA, a 2.92 expected ERA. I'm always a little concerned about how deep the Dodgers will let him work into games. He's only pitched over 6 innings twice this entire season. So that's always something that somewhat caps his upside. So to me, like I said, I'd rather get to Burns. I'd rather get to Scherzer. I'd rather get to Flaherty. There's a lot of good high-end pitching options to get to. And also then, depending on who the Diamondbacks pitch today, we could see the Dodgers just totally destroy Arizona. And this is probably seen all the time. If the Dodgers are up big in a game, they're not going to have their starting pitcher go deeper than 5 or 6 innings into the game. So to me, I somewhat question the upside of Kershaw, I wouldn't outright fade him, but I would definitely play more of Scherzer, Burns, and Flaherty.
Arizona's hitters too. I guess this is a sort of weak looking projected lineup for Arizona where you're going to have guys like a Dalton Varsho in it right now. I guess it depends how this one's going to look, but I'm surprised to see the season long sample size against left-hand pitching for Arizona. I guess maybe if this lineup is weaker, you could sort of give Kershaw a bump, but I would have on paper, I would think Arizona would give me some interest here, but I don't see the hitters that in this particular projected one being that great. Greg, do you like any Arizona stacks potentially?
No, I mean, so even though Kershaw, I don't think is as good of an option as some of the other elite starting pitchers on this particular slate, it doesn't mean I want to go out and stack against Clayton Kershaw. Also, the Dodgers have a pretty good bullpen, at least on the back end behind them. We've seen the Dodgers bullpen get a little bit sketchy when they're going to long relief in the middle innings, but I don't expect that to be something that pops up when Kershaw is on the mound. So no interest in the D-backs offense.
And we got the Dodgers against unknown pitcher X for Arizona, and mystery pitcher is what they're going to do today. And I feel like it's hard to prognosticate this one without knowing the pitcher and what hand they're going to be and all that. But the Dodgers, certainly a team you can get to. Generally, it does seem like the best that our data team can do. 4% chance of being a top stack, 3% ownership. So right now they look under-owned against this mysterious pitcher who will appear for Arizona. But Greg, any thoughts at all about this situation that is impossible to really talk about?
Just that it's impossible to talk about. I'll have other opinions, but I know who's starting for the D-backs. But I assume they're not going to be trotting an ace out. There's not going to be some unknown Cy Young pitcher that's going. So it more likely than not, it's probably going to be a good matchup for the Dodgers.
Lock in the Arizona mystery pitcher. That's the hot take for the day. Last game on the slate, Detroit, 3.6 implied runs going against Logan Gilbert. And Logan Gilbert, I guess based on what we saw yesterday in the same matchup, though on the other side of it, maybe Logan Gilbert throws a no-hitter today, but for generally on the year, 28% K rate for himself, 4.5 xFIP. The strikeout numbers, I guess, only facing 18 batters, so we'll see how that holds up over the course of time. But swinging strike rate and chase rate numbers, I think, give me some degree of hope. Detroit's bad enough that I could see taking a few flyers on Logan Gilbert. Good projection from Awesemo too, as well. A 15-point projection for him at $4,700 salary on DraftKings.
Yeah, and also low ownership. We're only projecting him for 12% ownership right now. So if you need to save salary, I certainly think he's a way to go. We have very little data on him right now, which is going to be the issue. Is going to be an issue with a lot of young pitchers this season because there was no minor league numbers from last year. But if you just look at the acumen of Gilbert as a prospect coming into the year, Fangraphs did have him ranked as the 35th overall prospect in all of baseball. So that in itself is pretty promising. I'll also lean a little bit on the Zips projection for this season, where they have him with the ERA in the mid fours, which whatever that's mediocre, they also have him striking out about a hitter per inning. So all that considered, it looks like Gilbert as of right now is probably somewhere in the lines of a back end starter. But when you consider a favorable matchup and also that he's so cheap on DraftKings as a potential SP2, that makes him definitely somebody that I've interest in as a value.
Yeah, it's a good matchup, and the thing that jumps out to me for Gilbert is the swinging strike rate and chase rate, which Awesemo said before you could sort of start to make earlier assumptions on because you're seeing X amount of pitches, about 4 pitches per at bat, but a 14% swing strike rate, a 41% chase rate. Obviously, they're not going to be that high forever, but I do think they show some signs of life here against a Detroit team that has not generally hit the ball pretty well against righties on the year and does have a 27.5% K rate. The other side, you have Tariq Skubal going against Seattle, and Skubal not even in Spencer Turnbull's league, which is an odd sentence to say, but I think Skubal, looking at these numbers, a 5.8 xFIP on the year since last season, a 5.3 xFIP, not a lot of strikeouts here, 20.4% strikeout rate, also began hit hard in terms of home runs, a 7% home run rate, giving up the perfect home run launch angle too. So Skubal to me, not a guy I would get to, and I feel like Seattle's hitters, you can make the case a little bit more though. Top stack still has him being deeply overowned.
Yeah, it's funny because you were talking about how Alex had mentioned to you that he doesn't see that the performance from the day before often dictates ownership very much. And if this holds true, today's currently projected ownership, that would certainly be a case of that because the Seattle Mariners, who seemingly get no hit once a week, or maybe that's a little bit of recency bias on my point, but they did get no hit by Spencer Turnbull yesterday. And now we have Seattle turning around with the third most projected ownership on the slate. I tend to think that number is going to come down, even if recency bias maybe doesn't impact offensive ownership as much as we would traditionally think. I can't imagine the field is going to be dying to roster a team that was no hit the day before. But as it stands now with this kind of ownership projection, no real interest in Seattle and no interest in Skubal from me either.
And Aiden Jones, one question here to close it out, and I think we could just talk about this briefly before we jump off. Would you play Kershaw on the 2-game late slate? I think that's a completely different thing, and it depends a lot on ownership. But I think you're playing him, and it's because it's a 2-game late slate. You're probably also stacking against him. Like, you just kind of take what you get for a late slate.
Yeah, you would for sure play Clayton Kershaw on the 2-game slate. Oh, and then one more thing I want to close with, because somebody asked us this, and I think it's a good bit. What is our no-hitter pick for the day?
The no-hitter pick for the day. So it has to be somebody who can go deep enough into games and has shown some strikeout ability. So Logan Gilbert probably can't get there today. I think for me, and it has to be somebody still like vaguely shitty because he's mostly been not great pitchers going there. So I think I would take David Peterson. I think he's pitching deep enough into games, getting some good strikeouts for himself, and he's going to no-hit Atlanta in Atlanta, which would be a real slap in the face to the entire Braves organization.
I'm just going to pick Tariq Skubal because I think it'd be really funny if the Mariners got no hit on back-to-back days.
It would be an amusing thing, and it does seem like Scooball's going to have 5% ownership for himself. So a lot of people buying that Mariners no-hitter narrative. Greg, give the people the plugs today. I think you're on Live Before Lock for NBA, but tell people where they could see you next.
Yeah, I'll be doing Live Before Lock for NBA tonight with Josh Engelman. And other than that, follow me on Twitter at Ehrenberg Dfs for B+ jokes and links to all my content.
And follow at Chris Spags as well. For me, mostly you can see whenever I'm doing a show on there. And also make sure you're using that Gold Rush promo while you can. It expires tomorrow, so get in there to get the 25% off your month there of Awesemo, plus all the data for MLB, NBA, all the sports that we have going on right now. You've heard the pitch before. Player projections, ownership projections, all the tools that we have. It's all at your fingertips if you go use that promo code GOLDRUSH at awesemo.com/join. We appreciate you guys for being here. We'll see you again soon. Enjoy your days and good luck.